It's 1945 in Europe. The war is over, but peace does not feel calm. Cities lay in ruins. Governments had fallen, and mass graves were being uncovered one after another. Liberation brought relief, but it also brought rage, grief, and an urgent need for punishment. People wanted answers, they wanted justice, and they wanted it to be seen. In this moment, a brutal execution method returned to public squares, one that would eventually lead to a merciless execution of hundreds. It was pole hanging, not used during the war, but after it, against those blamed for terror, betrayal, and mass suffering. However, there was only one difference now. This was no longer medieval Europe. This was the modern world, which meant pole hanging would be done in front of crowds. So why was this method chosen? Who faced it? And was this justice? Or something darker? Pole hanging was a specific form of execution that came from Central Europe, especially areas once ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At first glance, it looked similar to normal hanging, but in reality, it worked very differently and far more unpredictably. To understand pole hanging, you first need to understand short drop hanging. In short drop executions, the person does not fall far enough for their neck to break. Instead, death usually happens through strangulation, as the rope tightens around the neck and cuts off air and blood flow. This could take minutes. In contrast, long drop hanging, used later in places like Britain, was designed to snap the neck quickly and cause near-instant unconsciousness. Pole hanging was a short drop method, but instead of a complete gallows with a crossbeam, it used a single vertical wooden post, usually around 3 meters tall. A hook sat at the top. The condemned was lifted using straps and a pulley system, and a small noose was fixed around the neck. Once everything was set, the support holding the body was released, creating a short, sharp drop. Unlike standard gallows, this method relied heavily on human skill. The executioner and assistant had to work in perfect timing, guiding the body, tightening the rope, and sometimes trying to force the neck to one side to cause faster death. There were no precise calculations taken during the procedure. There was rarely a safety margin. When World War II ended, peace did not arrive quietly. In Czechoslovakia and Hungary, the war left behind burned villages, empty homes, and neighbors who had betrayed neighbors. People were not asking for calm justice. They wanted something they could see, something that felt final. That is why pole hanging returned. This was not just an execution method, it was a statement. Courts moved fast. Sentences were handed down quickly. But it was the executions that mattered most. Pole hangings were carried out in open spaces, in daylight, and in front of thousands. Outside Prague's Pankrak prison, and in the public squares of Budapest, wooden poles stood where everyone could see them. Justice was no longer hidden behind walls. It was put on display. The choice was deliberate. Pole hanging was familiar. It came from older Austro-Hungarian law, not from Nazi rule. By using it, these countries rejected German methods and reclaimed something that felt their own. The message was clear. This justice belonged to the people who had suffered, not to the regime that had crushed them. The executions were staged carefully. Convicted war criminals were marched out before crowds that often included survivors and grieving families. Some people cheered. Others watched in silence. The goal was not mercy. It was about being certain. The state wanted everyone to know that the men who had ordered deportations, massacres, and terror were powerless now. High-profile deaths made the point impossible to miss. In Prague, Karl Hermann Frank was hanged before thousands. In Budapest, former Prime Minister Ferenc Szalasi walked past the bodies of his allies before facing his own pole. These moments were photographed and shared widely. The images spread faster than words ever could. There were critics, even then. Pole hanging was slow. It often went wrong. People suffered in full view of the crowd. But in the ruins of post-war Europe, that cruelty was not seen as a flaw. It was part of the message. This was justice meant to be witnessed, remembered, and feared. Not hidden, not gentle, and not easily forgotten. As a result, things often went wrong. If the timing was off or the rope placement was poor, death was slow. The body could struggle. The person might remain conscious longer than expected. Several names, including the Austrian gallows, the strangling gallows, and Vera Galligan, were known for this method. It was rooted in old legal traditions, but by the mid-20th century, its use shocked many. Not because it was ancient, but because it was still happening in a modern world that claimed to be moving past such practices. Pole hanging was never an abstract form of justice. It had faces, names, histories, and crimes that entire nations remembered. The people executed this way were not petty offenders or distant figures pulled from dusty files. They were men and women whose decisions had shaped daily terror during the war, whose orders had sent neighbors to camps, and whose loyalty to Nazi power had helped turn occupation into mass murder. In the ruins of post-war Europe, pole hanging became the chosen punishment for those seen as beyond forgiveness. One of the most infamous was Karl Hermann Frank, the Nazi SS and police leader in Bohemia and Moravia. Frank played a central role in the brutal retaliation that followed the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. The village of Lidice was erased, its men executed, its women deported, and its children murdered or sent away. Frank's administration ruled through fear, mass arrests, and public executions. When he was captured after the war, there was little debate about his fate. On May 22, 1946, he was pole-hanged in Prague before a crowd of around 5,000 people. Witnesses noted that he showed no resistance and that the execution was swift, as if the state wanted the act to feel decisive rather than chaotic. Another figure was Kurt Daluege, head of the Order Police, an organization deeply involved in mass shootings and deportations across Eastern Europe. His role was less visible to civilians, but just as deadly. After Germany's defeat, he was extradited to Czechoslovakia, tried and executed in October 1946. He was hanged at the same site as Frank, using the same pole, a choice heavy with symbolism. It sent a message that rank, status, or distance from the battlefield offered no protection. In Hungary, the focus shifted to collaborators who had ruled directly over their own people. Ferenc Szalasi, leader of the Arrow Cross Party and Prime Minister of Hungary's Nazi-aligned government, oversaw the deportation and murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews. His execution in March 1946 was public and deeply symbolic. Unlike some others, his death was slow, highlighting the risks of pole hanging when the technique failed. Rather than weakening the message, this suffering seemed to reinforce the sense of punishment many demanded. Some cases shocked the public even more. Andras Kuhn, a Catholic priest turned Arrow Cross enforcer, led death squads that murdered Jews along the Danube. Witnesses testified that he personally shot civilians, including women and children. Seeing a priest executed publicly shattered any remaining illusion that moral authority had survived the war untouched. Even civilians were not exempt. Maria Nagy, believed to have informed on neighbors and aided deportations, was executed despite limited records of her case. Pole hanging a woman was rare, and that rarity made the warning even clearer. Each execution served two goals at once: punishment for crimes and reassurance for a shaken society that betrayal had consequences. Justice was not quiet. It was shown, named, and remembered. Pole hanging was not designed to be hidden. It was meant to be seen, felt, and talked about. From the moment the condemned were brought into public spaces, everything about the execution was deliberate. Authorities chose visible locations, often outside major prisons or in central squares, where crowds could gather easily. This was justice staged as an event, not carried out behind walls. In cities like Prague and Budapest, thousands attended these executions. Survivors of camps stood next to families who had lost relatives, and ordinary citizens, came to witness what they believed was the final chapter of the war. Unlike secret arrests or mass graves, pole hanging reversed the logic of occupation. Death was no longer hidden from the public. It was exposed, slow, and unmistakable. This visibility blurred the line between justice and psychological warfare. On one level, the executions punished individuals for documented crimes. On another, they sent a message to anyone who had collaborated quietly or hoped to escape notice. The message was simple and terrifying. The state was watching, and it would not forget. In societies that had lived under fear and silence, public executions acted as proof that power had changed hands. But the spectacle came at a cost. Pole hanging often failed to kill quickly. When the technique went wrong, the condemned struggled for minutes, sometimes longer, in front of thousands. For many in the crowd, the sight brought not relief but distress. Some people later described leaving shaken, unable to forget the sounds and movements they had witnessed. Justice, instead of closing wounds, sometimes reopened them. Authorities defended the method by claiming it was efficient and even humane when done correctly. In theory, the executioner's technique could cause rapid unconsciousness. In reality, mistakes were common. Ropes slipped, timing was off, and bodies twisted awkwardly. When this happened, the illusion of control cracked, revealing the raw violence beneath the ritual. Still, the state persisted. In the fragile political environment of post-war Eastern Europe, control mattered more than comfort. These executions reinforced authority, satisfied demands for visible punishment, and publicly humiliated former elites who had once seemed untouchable. Pole hanging became a tool not just of justice, but of dominance. It reminded the population who now held power, and it warned that the era of secret crimes without consequences was over. Whether it healed society or deepened its trauma remains debated, but its impact was undeniable. For those who witnessed it, pole hanging was impossible to ignore, and even harder to forget. Pole hanging placed an enormous burden on the executioner. Unlike gallows hanging, where measurements and gravity did most of the work, this method relied heavily on human precision. The executioner had to control timing, force, and body movement, all while standing before a crowd that would notice every mistake. He was not just carrying out a sentence, he was performing it. The technique required coordination between at least two people. One controlled the rope and release, while another assisted in positioning the body and applying pressure at the right moment. The goal was to cause rapid loss of consciousness, but achieving that required exact timing and strength. A slight misjudgment could turn the execution into a slow and disturbing struggle. Because of this, executioners in Czechoslovakia and Hungary often trained specifically for pole hanging. Even then, experience offered no guarantees. Each execution carried psychological pressure. Every failure was witnessed, recorded, and remembered. When things went wrong, the authority of the state was undermined, and the executioner carried the weight of that failure long after the crowd dispersed. Over time, these risks became harder to justify. As political systems stabilized and courts became more formal, the need for public spectacle faded. By the early 1950s, pole hanging began to disappear. The last known cases in Czechoslovakia occurred in 1954. Executions moved behind prison walls, carried out quietly and efficiently, away from public view. The decline of pole hanging was not driven by compassion alone. The method was complicated, unreliable, and increasingly seen as outdated. Governments preferred standardized procedures that minimized error and attention. The upright poles that once stood as warnings in public spaces were removed, and with them went a visible symbol of raw post-war justice. For a brief but intense period, pole hanging embodied the harshest form of consequence. It was justice shaped by anger, grief, and fear, delivered not quietly, but in full view of a world trying to understand how such crimes had happened at all. The war ended, but the questions never really did. Pole hanging wasn't just about punishment. It was about fear, power, and a world trying to prove it had moved on, even as it used brutal old methods to do so. These executions closed one chapter of history, but they opened another debate that still matters today. How should justice look after mass violence? And where is the line between justice and revenge? If you enjoy deep, honest stories like this that go beyond headlines and dig into the uncomfortable truth, subscribe to the channel. More forgotten history, real consequences, and untold stories are coming next.